Welcome to Pod Street, Writing WA's podcast. My name is Shelley and I am the intern here at Writing WA, and I'm joined by Josh Kemp. Josh is an author of Australian Gothic fiction. Banjawarn was joint winner of the 2021 Dorothy Hewett Award for an unpublished manuscript and his debut novel. His short stories have been published by Kill Your Darlings, Overland, Seizure, Tincture and Breach. He's previously been shortlisted for the Kill Your Darlings Unpublished Manuscript Award and longlisted for the Fogarty Literary Award. Currently completing his PhD at Edith Cowan University in Bunbury, he lives in the southwest of WA, but is drawn over and over again to the red dirt of WA's north. Josh, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Shelley.
My pleasure. So firstly, tell me a little bit about Jasper Cliff, your latest novel.
Yeah, so Jasper Cliff is a outback gothic thriller set in the remote East Pilbara region of WA, and it follows this young guy, Lachlan, whose little brother has gone missing. And the last place his brother is seen is this tiny little outpost called Jasper Cliff. So Lachlan decides to head up to the Pilbara and go in search of his brother, and he doesn't even make it to town before his car breaks down, and he finds himself having to rely on the kindness of strangers. He ends up marooned at the local pub where he's surrounded by a kind of ragtag cohort of locals, sort of weird and wonderful people. And he begins to suspect some of these strangers might not be as kind as they first appeared. And Jasper Cliff might be the kind of place where people go missing a bit too easily.
Wonderful. And it is a very interesting book, I have to say. I've just finished reading it. In terms of setting, why the Pilbara?
I've always loved the Pilbara, and I spent a lot of time up there on kind of holidays when I was a kid, and have been drawn back again and again. As you said in your opening, there's something about the red dirt, something about the landscapes of the north that have a kind of... I have basically an emotional connection to them, but I also find them fantastic to write about because they are some of the oldest landscapes that we know of on the planet. There's a place very near where I've set Jasper Cliff. So Jasper Cliff is set around the Marble Bar, Nullagine area, and there's a place up around there called the Jack Hills, and they've recently found some of the oldest microbial fossils on the planet there. And I know this, it sounds a bit kind of, I don't want to get sort of too numinous about it, but you can kind of sense how old that landscape is when you're moving through it. And so it seems like the kind of perfect setting for this kind of story. I also feel like as West Australian writers, we haven't maybe written about the Pilbara as much as we could have. I mean, it's such an important region in WA, but an important place for the whole of the country. It's often cited as, you know, the kind of the workhorse of the nation, right? It's producing all this kind of obscene wealth, and yet we, as writers, we don't often kind of cast our eye over that. I think that we could cast more of a critical eye over what's happening and the kind of things that are happening in the Pilbara when it comes to industry and when it comes to possibly some communities that I think are often forgotten about or not thought about enough.
Yeah, for sure. When I think about Australian Gothic fiction, I don't really consider the Pilbara, so it was nice to read a book that was within that genre, that was set in that area, especially with, you know, the age of the land and the rich history that it has. I feel like it really lent itself to that genre. And speaking of Australian Gothic fiction, what do you think are some of the hallmarks of that genre?
Yeah, it's great you sort of point that out, because I think quite often, you know, dark forests or stuff like that is quite often more featured in Australian Gothic fiction. You know, I think of something like Wintering by Chris Neen, set in Tassie. Tasmania is quite often a big setting for Australian Gothic because there are these ancient forests, these dark landscapes. But I guess for my Gothic, I like a bit of sunshine, I guess, and to kind of explore these landscapes that haven't been explored as much in Australian Gothic. I mean, for me, Australian Gothic, it really emerged from those early colonial stories that were kind of identified They weren't known as Gothic at the time, but I think a bunch of academics in the 90s sort of looked back at this early writing in the colony and pointed out that a lot of these writers were taking themes from European Gothic being sort of enormously popular at the time, and relocating a lot of these themes to an Australian landscape in order to write about their everyday experiences in the colonial days. And if you can imagine, it was an incredibly violent time. It was a very difficult time. And so, all that stuff from Gothic, I think most people identify Gothic as, crumbling castles and Frankenstein and stuff like that. But the genre has always looked at taboo subjects. When you kind of take away all that surface level goblins and ghouls, they're quite often stories about things like family violence and spiritual darkness, and I think those early colonial writers really responded to those themes and sort of started telling their own stories, exploring those more taboo subjects. As Australian Gothic has gone on, it's an incredible kind of, I would say it's kind of a broad church. These days, everything from the works of Patrick White to Wolf Creek, sort of highbrow to lowbrow are kind of considered Gothic. And I think that's what's so great about it. But at its core, it's always questioning. It's always asking these important questions about subjects I think we find pretty difficult to talk about.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think this sort of genre, you can repackage certain issues in ways that are perhaps a bit speculative or fantastical, and use that genre to address those issues. And I definitely noticed that throughout Jasper Cliff as well. In your opinion, were there certain issues that you've addressed in this book using that genre?
Yeah, I mean, I think my favourite Australian Gothic novels always ask questions about the relationship between non-Indigenous Australians and the landscape, and really interrogate that relationship, the fraughtness of it. When, as non-Indigenous people living in this country, you have all this history of, our ancestors being responsible for dispossession, violence against Aboriginal people, but also against the land itself. And it's sort of like, I think about this kind of on a daily basis. This legacy. How do we live in this place? How do we live on stolen land? That to me is really, I think, at the core of Jasper Cliff. And like I said, I think it's at the core of novels like The White Earth by Andrew McGann, which is a big favourite of mine, in which he uses a lot of those kind of classic Gothic tropes, but asks different kinds of questions about dispossession and about control of land and who has control of land and who has the say of what happens to the land. And I think those questions are really important to ask in the Pilbara. As I say, with the enormous industry, in the mining industry in the Pilbara, those are questions that we need to be asking.
Yeah, 100%. When you were talking about the violence against the landscape in particular, I was thinking about how certain mining companies are perhaps mistreating the land and not being respectful to the history that it has. So I feel like it's a very topical subject in this book. Are there any aspects that you think are overdone or cliche when it comes to Gothic fiction?
Well, we were talking about my PhD before, and my PhD really focused on this actually, and looking at this trope called white vanishing. So it's not just in Australian Gothic fiction, but throughout Australian literature, there is this kind of reoccurring trope right from kind of the early colonial writing right up to today, where there are many, many stories about white Australians kind of vanishing into the landscape, vanishing into Australian nature. And I guess the most famous example of this is Picnic at Hanging Rock. That'll be the one everyone knows. But when you kind of look at Australian literature a bit more closely, I think most people think it's mostly about children, and that's really not the case. It's adults are kind of represented in this trope just as much, but they're almost made childlike by the grandeur and the enormity of the land. And there's this really fantastic academic called Elspeth Tilley who looked at sort of the underlying meaning behind this trope and why Australian writers continue to tell stories about it. And also the stories kind of haven't really changed that much. They're kind of still the same thing. I think of, you think of Picnic at Hanging Rock, and recently, and I'm not being negative about this novel because I really enjoyed it. There's a novel called The Van Apfel Girls Are Gone, and it's almost like a contemporary kind of retelling of Picnic at Hanging Rock. It follows very much the same lines, even though I think it's resituated in the western suburbs of Sydney in the 90s. So that for me, I guess, not so much cliche, but again, I find that fascinating why we're stuck on it. Why are we kind of continuing to tell the same story? And Elspeth Tilley talks about how there's underlying meanings about, again, control of land. And, this trope really started in colonial writing, and it fixated on this idea that, white Australians were helpless and the land was almost kind of demonic and overwhelming and frightening. So by making Australian nature the villain, the white Australian characters are kind of, the heroes or the protagonists of the piece. We know now from what we know about Australian history that, that was quite often not the case. So that to me is really, really interesting. I think another trope that I'm seeing a lot it's in Australian Gothic fiction a lot, but also in crime fiction, particularly now we're seeing this enormous explosion of outback noir. The popularity of outback noir is the figure of the missing person. And I've done this myself in my own work, where I think missing people are used as almost like a narrative device. So someone's gone missing, the detective or the hero has to find out what happened to them, and then the story goes from there. And the missing person almost becomes kind of faceless. They become not a person, but like I say, a kind of narrative device. And when I went to Marble Bar to write this book, and on the first day actually, this was really brought home quite strongly to me by the local deli on the main street. I walked down to the deli to sort of have a look around town, and there's a community notice board on the deli, which a lot of these small towns have, and they're really important places for. Well, I say they're important. Sometimes they're just people selling lawnmowers and stuff like that, or they're used for like personal grievances, like Barry, you left my sheep out again, let my sheep out again, and stuff like that. But this notice board was completely covered in missing people posters. And I think I may have been feeling a bit vulnerable at the time because much like the main character in the book, my car broke down while I was in Marble Bar. But it just brought home the reality of long-term missing people in Australia, and obviously went away and did a lot of research for the book, and was determined for, if I was going to have a missing person in this novel, that they not become a faceless kind of symbol, that they not become a kind of narrative device, that they feel like a real person, and it bring home the kind of the gravity of that issue for the reader.
Yeah, it's something that I'm exploring myself in my writing as well, and my experience with consuming true crime content as well. It seems that victims and missing people seem to be faceless, and they just become this sensational part of the story, and their lives and what happened to them doesn't. You don't really understand the gravity of the situation. It becomes like more gossip.
Yeah,
and I find that in my writing, I'm trying to steer away from that and actually give them a backstory and a personality, and giving the reader time to understand them as people.
And I'm a big true crime buff too, and I actually think the good true crime is actually really difficult to find.
It really is, yeah.
And really good true crime writing actually does that. You know, it is more about the victim than the perpetrator, or it is more about the problem. So yeah, I agree with that. That's fantastic. You're doing that.
Well, it's great to meet someone who has similar interests in terms of, you know, trying to change the way that we consume that sort of content. So that's really great. When reading this book, I noticed that you have an incredible talent for describing the landscape, and you said that you actually visited Marble Bar to write this book, and I can see that now when reading it. So do you have any tips for people who are wanting to kind of create a character from the landscape and turn it into this bigger narrative device?
Yeah, I mean, I know it sounds a bit simple, but just immerse yourself in it as much as possible. And, you know, I planned to kind of go up to Marble Bar. This was originally only meant to be a novella, kind of under 50,000 words. And so I thought, I'll go up to Marble Bar for about a week, and then, of course, the car broke down, and I spent a little bit longer than I anticipated. But really, it was kind of the best thing that could have happened for the story, because I didn't have any other choice but to completely immerse myself in this town and this landscape. And I'm sure the locals, even though I didn't see the locals a lot of the time, because I was there in late November, so it was about 36 most days. And a lot of the locals will tell you, you know, they wake up in the aircon, they go to work in the aircon, they go home in the aircon. They don't actually spend a lot of time outside. And they call people like me heat tourists, you know, the kind of weirdos from the south wandering around in the 36-degree heat. So it was, although I was worried about my car, it was really a fantastic experience, because I could just drink in all the detail and all the textures and the colours. And I think if anyone had read my first novel, Banjawarn, they'll know that I get very fixated on detail, and sort of kind of regionally specific detail. I really want to drop the reader in that place and in that time as much as possible. I had a bit of leeway with this one because I decided to fictionalise the town. Whereas in Banjawarn, you know, I had maps of Kalgoorlie, and I was like making sure I'd named the right street corner, and, you know, Jester's was next to this shop, and then so people in Cow would be like, I know exactly what he's talking about. But for this one, I mean, in terms of the landscape writing, I spent a lot of time bushwalking. I'm a very keen bushwalker. Anyone who's read anything I've ever written will probably guess that. With Jasper Cliff, what I did was that was a little bit different, and I did the same with Banjawarn, was I took a lot of notes. And I did that on my phone. I used the notes folder on my phone. And sometimes it was literally just describing what I was seeing. And that was often dropped straight into the manuscript and wasn't edited that much. So that's a really good thing, I think, to do if you want to write about a landscape and you're doing a lot of bushwalking, to sort of absorb that detail. Take as many notes as possible, but not just physical descriptions of the land, also how it makes you feel. I think the scenes where Lachlan is kind of stumbling around out in the bush, he's mostly euphoric, and that's how I kind of felt while I was out there. I never felt any real threat from the land, or even though I had a kind of a close encounter with a black-headed python, which Glenn does in the book, that found its way into the book. I felt kind of very at ease and very peaceful in that place. So absorbing that, how the land also makes you feel, is also very important.
Yeah, wow, that's really great advice, and I think I'm going to be taking that advice as well. And it's funny how these little experiences in your life make their way into manuscripts. I know I have a scene in one of my manuscripts where it's inspired by me driving up with my dad for uni, and we were carrying a trailer, and I was still learning how to drive, and the tyre burst.
Oh, wow.
And we kind of veered off the road a little bit and had to stop in Narrogin. And so that's kind of made its way into my book in some form.
I'm at the point where things happen now and I go, oh, well, that's going to end up in a story. Like, it's just inevitable at this stage.
Exactly, yeah. All my family knows that, anything weird that happens in our lives is going to end up in a story somehow. So they're warned. But yeah, just going back to Banjawarn and Kalgoorlie, I'm just curious to know if there was any pushback in terms of publishing something that was set in like a real town rather than something fictional.
No, in fact, it was kind of, I think that's kind of what they loved about it, was that it was so specific. Obviously, towards the end of the novel, they head out to the actual Banjawarn station, and because of the way the story was going, I remembered, I thought, I'm going to have to fictionalise the station, because if anyone has read that novel, they know certain things happened that kind of meant that I had to fictionalise the station. But that is actually, I often, when I realise I have to fictionalise a town, so for Jasper Cliff, I realised I was kind of toying with the history of Marble Bar during while I was developing the story, and I thought that was kind of unfair. Whereas Banjawarn, whenever I was talking about history, I kept it very, very closely based on research. And very true to things that have happened down in the Northern Goldfields. But once I realised, I was kind of toying with history, I thought, okay, I have to fictionalise this area, because otherwise I would feel it'd be kind of unfair. But actually, that's my love, is actually just to write about real places and try and capture the realness of them. I know that sounds weird, and particularly places that are not written about very often. This year I went back to the Northern Goldfields and spent a long time in Laverton, which is an incredibly fascinating place, and with a very dark but very fascinating history. And the fact that it hasn't been written about very much is kind of astonishing to me. So I'm really drawn to those places, maybe the places that are not kind of very tourist heavy or anything like that. But those places are, I think it's important that we cast our eye on them and cast a critical eye on those areas, because those out of the way areas are sometimes where things go on that would never be allowed to happen in the city, would never be allowed to happen in Perth.
Yeah, it certainly feels like there's a different culture when it comes to country versus city, particularly in WA. So it's really great that you're exploring those towns and areas that might not necessarily be written about. That's really exciting. Is Laverton the only one that you're researching at the moment, or are there other ones that you're interested in?
Yeah, so this year I was working on I kind of hesitate to call it a sequel to Banjawarn, but it's kind of like, it does follow the characters. I would call it like a neo sequel, like it's kind of like a sequel, kind of not. Doing a lot of research into the Laverton, the area and the history, and things like there was a Royal Commission into policing in Laverton in the 70s. I didn't know that. Wow. Once you start looking into these small towns, you start to find all kinds of stuff that are kind of unbelievable, but true.
Yeah, so, well, they say truth is stranger than fiction sometimes, so certainly true. Lastly, what books are currently on your to-be-read pile?
Oh, well, I thought I would definitely mention the book I just read, which was Dusk by Robbie Arnott. I'm a big fan of Robbie Arnott's, and I think Dusk is my favourite novel of his so far. It is just wonderful. And if you like landscape writing, if you like nature writing, it's definitely, I think, do I say this? I think it's probably my favourite novel of the year so far.
Wow, okay.
I know that's a big call, but so it's set in kind of the Tassie Highlands in the late 1800s. It's sort of like a Western, sort of not. It's really beautiful. And what's on my desk right now? I'm reading this a book called The Crimson Labyrinth, which I can't remember the writer's name, but it's like a horror novel set in the East Kimberley. So it's actually set in Purnululu, which is why I was kind of drawn to it. And it's like, imagine Survivor but maybe more like Squid Games, right? Like, the contestants have to do away with each other to survive. It's just, I'm only like 40 pages in, but it's completely out there. And the writer makes really fantastic use of the Bungle Bungle range, because it is kind of the most extraordinary landscape you'll ever see. It does feel like something from another planet. So yeah, that's what I'm reading now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Josh, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And this has been Writing WA's Pod Street. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley.